She stood calmly on the courthouse steps, holding a coffee and a folder, when two police officers rushed up and demanded her ID. Within seconds, they were reaching for their cuffs. What they didn't know was who she really was. Before we start the story, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. "Ma'am, step back," Officer Bradley said firmly, his hand hovering near his belt. "You're not allowed to stand here without a reason." His voice rang out across the courthouse steps, sharp and loud enough to draw attention. A few people slowed their walk, turning to look. A woman stood still, holding a paper coffee cup in one hand and a dark leather folder in the other. Her suit was clean, her expression calm, and her posture firm. She didn't move. "I'm just waiting," she said softly, not raising her voice, not stepping back. "I need to see some ID," Bradley said again, stepping closer. His partner, Officer Harris, joined him. Harris exchanged a brief glance with Bradley, sensing the growing crowd. Alina kept her eyes on them. "May I ask why?" Bradley didn't blink. "You're matching a description," he replied quickly. Alina raised one eyebrow slightly. "What description is that?" Harris answered this time. "Suspicious behavior. Hanging around government buildings. You've been standing here for too long." Alina stayed quiet for a moment. Her voice remained calm. "Standing quietly is now suspicious?" Bradley's tone grew sharp. "Listen, I'm not going to go back and forth. If you don't show ID, I'll have to detain you." A young man across the street stopped and pulled out his phone. A woman walking past slowed her pace and turned toward the scene. Alina looked at the folder in her hand but said nothing. Her heart beat a little faster now, but her face didn't show it. Bradley moved closer again. "You're refusing to comply. I'm calling this in." He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a female individual here. Late 30s, possibly hostile. Non-compliant." "Hostile?" Alina repeated, her voice still low. "I've said nothing except ask a question." Officer Harris stepped closer and placed a hand on her arm. "We're asking nicely. Don't make this worse." Alina gently pulled her arm back. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't moved from this spot. What exactly have I done wrong?" Bradley's eyes flicked to the folder. "What's in that?" "Documents," Alina answered plainly. "Let me see them." "You have no right to search me without cause." Bradley folded his arms. "So you know the law?" Alina said nothing. From behind the small crowd, someone called out, "She hasn't even done anything." A few heads nodded. Phones were now pointed directly at the scene. Bradley's jaw tightened. "That's enough. You're coming with us." He stepped forward and reached out to take her arm, but Alina didn't step back. She simply opened the folder and held out a card toward him. "You may want to look at this first," she said evenly. Bradley hesitated, then took the card and glanced down. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He looked at her again, now blinking fast. Harris leaned over to see the card and immediately took a step back. People in the crowd leaned in, quiet now. Bradley's face drained of color. "You're?" He paused. "Yes," Alina said calmly. Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably. I didn't realize." The energy around them shifted. The air felt heavier. The crowd, once passive, now leaned in even closer. Bradley took 2 steps back, clearly rattled. The card in his hand had changed everything. But the truth hadn't even fully landed yet. Not for him, not for anyone watching. Officer Bradley stared at the card in his hand as if it had burned him. His fingers trembled slightly. The badge on it gleamed under the morning sun. Clear, undeniable, official. His lips parted, but no words came out. Alina didn't move. Her calm gaze remained fixed on him. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Officer Harris swallowed hard. "Are you actually a federal judge?" he asked, his voice dropping lower now. Alina nodded slowly. "Not just a judge." Bradley's face paled further. He flipped the card over and read the title out loud without meaning to. "Associate Justice, United States Supreme Court." Gas rippled through the small crowd. The young man with the phone muttered, "No way," while the woman beside him whispered, "That's who she is." Harris took a half step back, straightening his posture, suddenly more formal. We apologize, ma'am. We didn't know. Alina's voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't ask. You just assumed. Bradley opened his mouth again. We thought you might have been someone else. There was a report earlier. There's always a report, Alina interrupted softly. Always someone matching a vague description. Always a reason to approach, question, detain. Bradley glanced at Harris. Harris looked down. You didn't even ask why I was here, she said. You didn't let me speak. You didn't even consider that I might belong. Harris tried to defend himself. We didn't mean any disrespect, but you showed it anyway, she said. Not with words, but with your actions. You reached for your cuffs before you reached for the truth. The crowd was silent now. No one moved. Every phone was still raised. Alina turned to face the people watching. She scanned their faces, many of them strangers, some shocked, some embarrassed, and some nodding slowly in agreement. Her voice was steady. This is what happens every day to people who don't carry this badge, who don't hold this title, who don't have this protection. Bradley's hand fell to his side. We truly didn't know who you were, ma'am. Alina looked at him one last time. But you thought you knew what I wasn't. And with that, she turned her back to them and began walking up the courthouse steps. The folder was still in her hand. The crowd parted without a word. The officers stood frozen behind her, feeling the weight of what they'd just done, but not yet knowing what it would cost. Alina stepped through the tall glass doors of the courthouse, leaving the growing whispers and flashing cameras behind. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way toward the courtroom wing. Inside, the air was quiet, polished, professional, so different from the chaos she had just walked through. But her thoughts were far from calm. She didn't shake or tremble. She didn't cry. She simply walked with her jaw clenched and her mind steady. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but this time it had unfolded in front of dozens of people, officers, strangers, witnesses. A court assistant, Darren, spotted her from across the hall and hurried over, slightly out of breath. Justice Alina, he said, eyes wide. We didn't expect you until later. Is everything all right? Alina gave a small nod. I'm here now. Darren's eyes darted toward the doors. I saw some of that. I didn't realize what was happening at first. They didn't recognize you. They didn't care to, she replied. That's how it always starts. Darren's face turned red. Should I inform someone? Do you want to file a complaint? Alina didn't answer immediately. She glanced behind her at the doors. Through the glass, she could still see the two officers standing outside, stiff, silent, unsure of what to do next. They'll learn soon enough, she said quietly. Not from me, but from the truth that's coming. She handed Darren the folder. The notes are ready. Let the clerks know I'll join the bench in 30. Yes, ma'am, Darren replied, hurrying off. Alina stood still for a moment. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished courthouse walls. A black woman in a place of power, still stopped, still questioned, still doubted. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in weakness, but in focus. She wasn't just walking into a courtroom today. She was walking into something bigger, something that had started outside on the street, but wasn't going to end there. Justice wasn't just a word behind her name. It was a weight, and today she was going to carry it like never before. Outside, Officer Bradley stood near the patrol car, his hands now resting nervously on his belt, eyes glued to the ground. Officer Harris paced slowly beside him, barely speaking. Neither of them had expected their morning to unravel like this. They had made a mistake, one that was now being recorded, whispered about, and possibly reported. Bradley broke the silence. Did you know who she was? Harris shook his head. Of course not, but maybe that's the point. Bradley exhaled slowly, glancing toward the building. She looked. Yeah, Harris interrupted, his voice low. Exactly, that's the problem. Bradley didn't respond. His throat tightened. He felt the stares from the people nearby. Some still held their phones. Others just looked at them like they were the villains in a story that was already being told. A courthouse officer stepped outside and walked toward them with purpose. He was tall, clean-cut, with a badge that shimmered under his jacket. He stopped a few feet away and stared at both men. "Are you the officers who confronted Justice Alina on the steps?" he asked directly. Bradley straightened up. "Yes, sir. We weren't aware. She just made it very clear that your behavior was inappropriate," the man said without flinching, "and it didn't go unnoticed." Harris tried to explain. "It was a misunderstanding. We thought she was loitering." The courthouse officer raised a hand. "You didn't ask for her name. You didn't ask why she was here. You saw a woman with dark skin in a folder and decided that was enough." Bradley opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. "She's not filing a formal complaint yet," the man added, "but you need to be ready for what's coming next. That footage is already making its way online, and I can tell you right now, this is bigger than just a bad call." Bradley looked down at his boots. "Whatever happens next," the officer said, "you brought it on yourselves." And with that, he turned and walked back inside, leaving the two men standing on the courthouse steps, exposed, unsure, and suddenly aware that their mistake wasn't just about one woman. It was about a system, and their part in it was now in full view. Inside the courthouse, Alina walked slowly down the long hallway, her footsteps steady but heavy. Portraits of past justices lined the walls. Men in dark robes, mostly white, mostly old. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she passed, frozen in time, silent observers of the present. She stopped in front of one painting, an older justice known for landmark decisions on equality. For a moment, she just stared at the face on the wall. Then she whispered to herself, "Even now, the fight continues." The courtroom was still empty when she entered. She liked it that way, silent, still, untouched by the noise of the outside world. The room smelled of old wood and polished floors. She moved toward the bench and placed her folder down carefully. Her hand rested on the smooth surface for a moment longer than needed. This wasn't just her workplace. It was the very heart of justice. But today, even in here, she carried a storm within her. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and allowed herself to feel it. Not anger, though it lingered. Not sadness, though it whispered. It was something deeper, a feeling that mixed pain with responsibility. She had climbed her way into this seat through years of hard work, silent endurance, and strength she rarely showed. But power, she knew, didn't make her invisible. It didn't make her safe. Even the highest titles couldn't shield her from assumptions, from suspicion, from humiliation. Her thoughts wandered back to the officer's voice, firm, dismissive, sure of himself. He didn't ask. He didn't wonder. He just saw her and decided what she must be. That was the part that sat the heaviest. Across the room, the door opened quietly. Her longtime clerk, Farah, entered carrying a thick file of documents. She hesitated when she saw Alina sitting silently at the bench. "Ma'am?" Farah said softly. "Everything all right?" Alina looked up. "Yes," she replied gently. "Just thinking." Farah moved closer and placed the file on the table. Her eyes searched Alina's face. "I heard about what happened outside." Alina nodded slowly. "It happened. It's not the first time." Farah hesitated, then spoke carefully. "But this time, people saw, and now they know who you are." Alina gave a half smile. "They know my title. That's not the same as knowing who I am." Farah sat in the nearby chair. "I keep thinking, what if it had been me instead of you?" Alina's eyes turned to her. "Then maybe you'd be sitting in the back of a patrol car right now, and no one would believe your version of the story." Farah's face tightened. "Do you think the officers will be held accountable?" Alina leaned back in her seat. "Maybe, maybe not. But this isn't just about them. It's about what their actions represent. The way a uniform gives people confidence, even when they're wrong. The way a skin tone invites suspicion, even when you're right." She paused, her eyes sharp now. "But what they did today, they did in front of witnesses. And now those witnesses have a voice." Farah nodded slowly, her eyes filled with quiet respect. Alina stood, picking up her folder again. "The courtroom is open now. Let's begin the session." Farah rose too, but before turning to leave, she said, "You handled it with strength." Alina gave a small nod. "Strength is the only thing they can't take from me." And with that, she walked to the chambers, her robe flowing gently behind her. The courtroom doors would open soon, but outside those doors, the real trial had already begun, and the world was watching. Outside the courthouse, the scene had grown larger than either Officer Bradley or Officer Harris expected. News vans had started to arrive, their antennas rising like metal trees reaching for attention. Reporters stood with microphones in hand, whispering updates into their earpieces as they prepared to go live. People were gathering in clusters, replaying the video that was now spreading like fire across every platform. The clip was less than a minute long, but it was powerful. It showed everything. Alina standing still, calm, while two officers grew more aggressive, more impatient. It captured the moment she revealed her badge, when the power dynamics shifted completely, and then it ended with silence, with realization painted across Bradley's face. Online, it was already trending. Thousands of comments poured in within an hour. She didn't even raise her voice. What if she wasn't a judge? This is how they treat black professionals in broad daylight. She was calm, smart, and still treated like a criminal. Bradley watched a clip of the video on his phone, his hand cold against the screen. His name had been mentioned in several posts already. Someone from the crowd must have recognized his badge number. His chest tightened as he read the words written under one video. This man tried to arrest a Supreme Court justice because he couldn't see past her skin. Harris stood beside him, silent, looking out at the crowd that had nearly doubled in size. He glanced at Bradley. "This is not going away," he muttered. Bradley didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Just then, a woman stepped through the crowd with confident strides. She wore a gray suit, her ID badge clipped neatly to her jacket. Her voice was clear and firm as she approached. "Officers Bradley and Harris?" They both turned toward her. "I'm Agent Roslin from Internal Affairs. I've been assigned to open a preliminary inquiry into this morning's incident. You'll be expected to report to headquarters by 3 p.m. today." Bradley tried to maintain composure. "We didn't use force. There was no arrest." "That may be true," Roslin said, not unkindly, "but perception matters. The public saw what they saw, and the department takes incidents involving high-ranking officials seriously, especially when those incidents reflect poorly on the badge." Harris cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we didn't know who she was." Roslin didn't blink. "That's not the point. You treated her the way you did because you thought she wasn't anyone important. That's the part that matters." Bradley's jaw tightened. "What if this ruins our careers, all over one mistake?" Roslin sighed. "Maybe it's not about a mistake. Maybe it's about a habit you didn't know you had until someone powerful stood in front of you and made you see it." She handed each of them a folded packet. "You'll be interviewed, reviewed. You'll have a chance to explain everything. But I suggest you start by understanding what went wrong. Because trust me, the whole world already has." Without another word, she turned and walked back through the crowd. Bradley watched her go, his face pale. Harris stood with his arms folded tightly across his chest, saying nothing. The news reporters were live now, facing the camera. One woman spoke directly into her mic. "We are standing outside the federal courthouse where a dramatic confrontation took place earlier this morning between two local officers and a Supreme Court justice who was racially profiled while simply arriving for work. The officers have yet to make a public statement. The department has already confirmed that an internal investigation is underway." Bradley took a deep breath and looked away from the camera lights. But it was too late. He wasn't just in the background anymore. He was the story, and this story wasn't going to disappear quietly. By the afternoon, the story had reached every major news outlet in the country. The clip of the courthouse steps had aired on live television and been reposted by influencers, journalists, activists, and even celebrities. It wasn't just news anymore. It had become a symbol, a moment that captured the ugly truth behind everyday interactions faced by millions, even those at the highest levels of success. Inside the courthouse, Alina sat alone in her chambers, away from the noise. The thick curtains muffled the sounds of the outside world, but not her thoughts. Her phone buzzed constantly on the desk, messages from colleagues, public officials, friends from across the country. Some offered support, some expressed shock, and many simply said what they all were thinking. That could have gone very differently. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the high ceiling. She had spent years in these halls, years proving herself. Years building a name that now echoed through the chambers with weight and meaning. Yet today proved something deeper. No matter how far she had come, she still wasn't immune to being mistaken for a threat. Not because of what she said or did or carried, but because of who they thought she was before even asking. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Farah stepped in quietly. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you. He says it's important." Alina glanced up. "Who?" Farah hesitated. "He says he's the police chief. Chief Holden." Alina's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. "Send him in." Moments later, Chief Holden entered, removing his cap respectfully. He was an older man, his uniform sharp and his steps deliberate. His face showed the weight of someone who had seen too much and was now seeing too much again. "Justice Alina," he said gently. "Thank you for seeing me." She gestured to the seat across from her desk. "Please." He sat down, looking uncomfortable but sincere. "I came in person because I didn't want to send an email or a written apology. That wouldn't be enough." Alina folded her hands. "I assume you've seen the footage." "I have," he said. "And I'm not going to defend what happened. I won't insult you by saying they meant no harm, because the harm was done. Not just to you, but to every officer out there who works hard to serve with dignity and has to now carry the weight of someone else's mistake." She nodded slowly. They didn't act alone. They acted on instinct, and that instinct didn't come from nowhere. The chief sighed deeply. That's the part that hurts the most. Somewhere along the way, that uniform started to feel like a shield. Not for protection, but for control. And it's officers like those two that make it harder for the rest to rebuild trust. Alina looked him in the eye. "So what are you going to do about it?" He didn't look away. "There will be accountability. That's already in motion. But I want to do more than just discipline two men. I want to begin a review of every officer's conduct in this city, starting with how they're trained to approach people, how they speak, how they think, and most importantly, what they assume before they ask." Alina was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Words are a good beginning, but action is the only apology that matters." Chief Holden nodded. "I agree, and I want you to be part of it." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I want you to speak to the department, not as a judge, not as a symbol, but as a human being who experienced what too many others go through every day. I believe they need to hear it, not from a report, from you." Elena leaned back, considering it. Her expression was unreadable. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But if I speak, I won't hold back." "I wouldn't ask you to," the chief replied. "It's time they hear the truth from someone they can't ignore." He stood and adjusted his cap. "Thank you for your time, Justice. And thank you for your patience in the face of what should never have happened." She nodded once. "Thank you for coming in person. That matters." When the door closed behind him, Alina sat still, her fingers tracing the edges of her desk. The visit hadn't erased what happened, but it had shifted something. A door had opened. Now the question was whether those on the other side were ready for what was coming through. She looked out the window. The sky was turning gray, clouds rolling in over the courthouse dome. A storm was coming, but maybe this one could wash something clean. By early evening, the city was buzzing. News tickers ran headlines in red. Supreme Court Justice profiled outside courthouse. Police chief meets with justice amid outcry. Nation reacts to viral video. In offices, barbershops, living rooms, and train stations, people watched the footage on repeat. Some were outraged, others were stunned. Many weren't surprised at all. Inside her home, Alina sat on the edge of her bed. No robe, no courtroom, just herself. The sun had nearly disappeared beyond the city skyline outside her window, casting long shadows across the room. Her shoes were still on, but her posture had relaxed. On the nightstand, her phone buzzed again, messages pouring in from all directions. Senators, civil rights leaders, judges, friends from childhood she hadn't heard from in years. She stared at the screen, unread messages stacking one after another, but her mind was somewhere else. She thought of a day years ago, long before she wore robes, long before anyone called her Justice. She had been 16, walking home from the library, carrying a backpack full of books, wearing the same tired sneakers she'd worn for months. A patrol car had slowed beside her. Two officers inside. They asked what she was doing, where she was going, and if the books were really hers. They asked to see her ID, even though she was a minor. She remembered how scared she'd been, not just because they didn't believe her, but because she'd known they didn't want to believe her. And now, decades later, nothing had changed except the clothes she wore and the building she entered. A soft knock came at the door. It opened gently before she could respond. Her younger brother, Malik, stepped inside. He lived in another state but had flown in as soon as he saw the video. He was tall, quiet, and thoughtful, his presence always steady. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there looking at her. "You all right?" he asked gently. Alina gave a slight smile. Still standing, Malik walked over and sat across from her on the armchair by the window. "I watched the video 10 times before I could even call you. I was so angry I couldn't think straight." She nodded slowly. "You weren't the only one." They didn't even flinch. They were about to arrest you. And for what? Breathing in public while black? Alina looked at him. "They didn't see me. They saw a shape, a threat, an assumption." Malik shook his head. "If you didn't have that badge—" "I know," she said softly. "I know." He leaned forward. "So what now? You're just going to let the department sweep it under the rug? Let them apologize and move on?" Alina met his eyes. "I'm not." Malik's expression shifted, half concern, half pride. She stood and walked slowly to her desk across the room. On it sat a single folder, freshly typed. She opened it and pulled out a printed statement, already signed. "What's that?" Malik asked. "A letter I'm reading live tomorrow," she replied. "A message. Not just to the police department, but to the whole country." He stood slowly. "You're really doing it?" "Yes," she said. "They wanted to remind me of my place. So I'm going to remind them of mine. And everyone else's who walks around this world being judged before they're even greeted." Malik's eyes glistened, though he blinked quickly to hide it. "You're going to shake this whole place, you know that?" "I'm not trying to shake it," she said, picking up the letter. "I'm trying to rebuild it." He walked over and hugged her tightly. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." She held on to him for a moment longer, then pulled back, looking determined. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about the next black girl standing on a sidewalk, the next young man reading a book outside, the next person wearing the wrong clothes in the wrong neighborhood. I have a platform. I'm going to use it." Malik nodded. "Then let them hear you." Outside, the night deepened. The city lights flickered to life one by one, and inside that quiet room a storm was forming, one not of destruction, but of reckoning. Alina's voice, silenced for a moment on the steps of a courthouse, was about to rise louder than ever before. The next morning arrived with a sky heavy with clouds, as if the weather itself anticipated what was about to unfold. News cameras gathered outside the Civic Hall, where Alina had agreed to speak. It wasn't a court proceeding, nor a press conference arranged by political staff. It was something she had arranged herself, through her own channels by her own hand. A small wooden podium stood at the front of the wide marble foyer, backed by a high wall etched with the words "Equal Justice Under Law." The phrase had always felt powerful to her, almost sacred, but now it felt more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Inside, the room was packed. Judges, law clerks, police officers, journalists, activists, students, every row filled. Some had come out of curiosity, others had come with questions, but most had come because they felt something shift inside them when they saw the video. Alina stood in the wings, holding the same folder she had carried on the morning of the incident. Malik stood beside her, his face calm but tense. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel his support like a steady flame in the space between them. Farah approached from the side, her voice low. "You're on in 1 minute." Alina nodded. She glanced once more at the paper in her hand, then gently closed the folder. "They need to hear this from me, not from a screen, not from a press release, from a person." With that, she stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking. There was something about her presence that drew people to attention. Not forceful, not grand, but deeply rooted. She stood behind the podium and looked out at the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was steady, clear and slow. 2 days ago, I was nearly handcuffed for standing in front of the very building where I have delivered justice for years. I was not shouting. I was not trespassing. I was not resisting. I was simply existing. And that, it seems, was enough to be treated like a suspect. A quiet shift moved through the room. Phones rose in the air, now recording. I am a Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. That title is supposed to protect me. But it didn't protect me from being seen as a threat before I could be seen as a person. She paused, letting the words settle. But this is not a story about me, she continued. This is a story about what we've allowed to live in the corners of our institutions, about the power of assumptions, about the damage of silence, and about the weight of skin color in a world that claims to see character. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward. Some sat frozen. If I had not shown that badge, how would that moment have ended? Would I have been thrown to the ground? Would I have been arrested? Or would I have been added to a list of names spoken in sorrow instead of in celebration? She looked directly at the row of uniformed officers sitting to her left. You see, we always ask the wrong question. We ask, why did this happen to her? But the real question is, why does it keep happening to us? A few people clapped gently, but she raised her hand, not to stop them, but to hold the moment still. I don't want pity. I want change. I want training that teaches not just tactics, but humanity. I want officers to pause before acting, to ask instead of assume. I want our legal system to reflect the people it claims to protect, not fear them, not dismiss them, not harm them. Her voice deepened slightly now, not louder, but heavier. This is not about one man or two. It's about the quiet chain that links them to thousands of others who never had a camera to protect them, or a title to defend them. We remember the names of some, but there are too many we never knew. Tears welled in a few eyes. A young woman in the third row wiped her cheek. I am standing here not as someone above this experience, but as someone within it. Even from the highest bench, I am not safe from judgment. But today I use that bench, that voice, and that experience to demand something better. For me, for you, and for the ones who's still to come. She paused. The room was silent, hanging on her next breath. I am not here today to ask. I am here to insist. Change is no longer a choice. It is overdue, and it is coming. She stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted a full 3 seconds. Then the room erupted into applause. Not a polite ripple, but a full wave of clapping, rising to a standing ovation. Even the officers stood, some with their heads bowed, others clapping slowly, as if realizing for the first time the weight of what they had seen and heard. As Alina stepped down from the stage, Malik met her with a look of pride too deep for words. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The country had heard her now, not just her voice, but her truth. And it had changed the air. The speech spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, clips of Alina's words were being shared not just across the country, but around the world. Social media lit up with quotes pulled from her address. Words like, even from the highest bench, I am not safe from judgment. And change is no longer a choice. It is overdue, appeared on screens, posters, protest signs, and even digital billboards in Times Square. People who had never paid attention to judicial figures before now spoke her name with admiration. Activists called it one of the most powerful public speeches of the decade. Schools played it in classrooms. Civil rights groups used it as a rallying cry. A movement that had already existed found new momentum through her measured voice and undeniable truth. But in the center of that storm, Alina stayed quiet. She returned to work, kept her schedule, and avoided interviews. She wasn't chasing cameras or headlines. She had said what she needed to say. The rest would be action, or it would be nothing. Still, the pressure on the police department grew rapidly. Internal Affairs was forced to accelerate their investigation. Officer Bradley and Officer Harris were placed on administrative leave, and within days both were summoned to a closed-door disciplinary hearing that included community leaders, legal observers, and oversight committee members. Inside that quiet, windowless room, both men sat stiffly in their uniforms. Their lawyers had spoken on their behalf, arguing the incident was a misunderstanding. that no laws were broken, that no harm was done, but it was clear to everyone that the harm had been done, just not in the way the officers had been trained to understand. Alina did not attend the hearing. She had no interest in watching two men try to explain away their choices. She believed in accountability, but not in public humiliation. Her fight was never against those two officers alone. It was against what they represented, but others attended on her behalf. Farah gave a statement. So did Malik. So did two legal clerks who worked under her, both of whom described the fear they'd felt watching the video, knowing it could just as easily have been them. And then came someone no one expected. A man in his 60s, dressed in a simple gray coat, stepped forward. He cleared his throat and introduced himself as Gerald Bryant, a retired officer and longtime mentor within the force. He had trained both Bradley and Harris years ago. I taught them the basics, he said, his voice thick with age and memory. Taught them how to read a scene, how to approach without escalating. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing people and started seeing profiles. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. I'm not here to defend them. I'm here to admit something harder, that I didn't prepare them for what this badge would do to their judgment over time. I didn't tell them that the job would tempt them to see fear where there is none, to lean on bias when answers are unclear. There was a long silence. That failure is mine too. He stepped back, and no one said a word for several seconds. After the hearing, the department announced sweeping reforms, not just sensitivity training or diversity seminars, but a full restructuring of how officers were evaluated, how complaints were processed, and how assumptions were addressed within the chain of command. They called the new policy the Sightline Standard, named after Alina's closing words, "Ask before you act. See before you judge." Meanwhile, Alina remained in her chambers, reading case files, attending hearings, writing decisions. She received letters every day, some handwritten, others typed. Some from young girls who wanted to be judges now. Some from mothers who cried watching her speech. Some from police officers who admitted that her story had shaken something loose inside them. But there was one letter that she kept tucked into the back of her notebook. It was from a woman named Patrice, a mother from St. Louis. It read, "My daughter saw your video. She's 12. She asked me if she could stand outside our courthouse just to see if people would listen to her the way they listen to you. I told her they probably wouldn't. But then I said, maybe one day they will, because of women like you." Alina held that letter late into the night, rereading the words slowly, carefully, letting them wrap around the ache that still lingered from the sidewalk encounter that had started it all. The fight was far from over, but the fire had spread, and now the world was watching with open eyes. Weeks passed, but the waves Alina had stirred didn't settle. If anything, they reached further, deeper, into places that had been quiet for too long. Cities across the country began reviewing their own policing practices. Universities invited her to speak. Law schools dissected her courtroom opinions alongside her speech, calling her a model of judicial intellect and public conscience. But Alina didn't chase that spotlight. She kept moving, quietly, steadily, just as she always had. She sat on panels, she wrote decisions, she mentored law students, and late at night, she returned to her apartment and sat in silence, sometimes staring at the ceiling for hours. Because what had happened that day had changed her too, not just in the eyes of the world, but in the quiet space where her confidence once lived untouched. She had always known she was being watched, judged. But now there was a bruise beneath the surface, one she didn't show, one she didn't name. One night, as she walked home from court, rain began to fall in fine cold sheets. The city lights blurred behind droplets on her glasses. She pulled her coat tighter and turned down a side street for a quieter path. That's when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Her body tensed instantly. A man's voice called out, not loudly, but close enough to make her pause. "Excuse me, Justice Alina?" She turned slowly, her heartbeat rising. A man stood beneath a flickering streetlight, holding a worn briefcase, rain soaking the shoulders of his coat. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said quickly. "My name is Rayhan. I'm a defense attorney. I recognized you and I just wanted to thank you." She didn't speak. She was still on edge. He noticed and took a careful step back. "I'm not here for anything, I promise. Just, just this." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small envelope, shielding it from the rain. "This isn't a fan letter or anything like that," he said. "It's a copy of a motion I filed last week. The judge ruled in our favor, and I based it, word for word, on your opinion in case 1279. Her eyes softened slightly. "You're quoting my dissent?" He smiled. "Yes, ma'am. The one about unlawful search and the right to pause. You wrote that people shouldn't be punished for the moments when they hesitate. That hesitation is human, not guilt. That stuck with me." She took the envelope slowly, tucking it into her coat. "Thank you, Rayhan." He looked up at her, more serious now. "You don't know how many people like me you've helped. Quietly, without fanfare. You're a map for us. Those of us trying to fight the right fights in the places that still resist change." He hesitated, then added, "I also saw the video." She nodded slightly. "It broke something in me," he said. "Seeing you treated like that. If someone like you could be dismissed so easily, what chance do the rest of us have?" Alina looked at him, truly looked at him. Behind his words was exhaustion, a quiet kind, the kind that builds over years, not days, the kind only someone inside the system could understand. She spoke softly. "We keep going, Rayhan. We speak when it's easy and when it's not, and we carry those who haven't found their voice yet." He exhaled as if he'd been waiting to hear that. "Thank you, ma'am, for all of it." With a nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. Alina stood alone for a moment, envelope in hand, the city moving slowly around her. Something inside her chest eased, not healed, not forgotten, but eased. She made her way home and placed the envelope on her desk. Before removing her coat, she lit a candle near the window, a quiet ritual she'd begun after the courthouse incident. One small light to remind herself, not all change is loud. That night, she slept without tension in her shoulders for the first time in weeks. And in the morning, she woke before sunrise, ready to write again. Not a speech, not a statement, a decision. One that would shape the law, one that would outlive the headlines, one that would speak for the unheard in the only language that the system could not ignore. Law, written in truth, carved in experience, and rooted in justice. The weeks turned into months, and though the headlines eventually moved on, the ripples from that single morning outside the courthouse continued to grow, quietly transforming the world in ways no one had anticipated. The media had slowed its coverage. The hashtag stopped trending. But in classrooms, in courtrooms, in training academies, and late-night law school debates, Alina's name and her words lived on. The Department of Justice invited her to help review new national guidelines on police conduct and racial bias. It wasn't just symbolic. Her insight was sought after, her lived experience treated not as a footnote, but as foundational. She didn't push to be part of it. She never needed to. When a voice rings with truth, it finds the rooms where decisions are made. And it wasn't just government bodies that changed. A quiet revolution had begun in legal culture itself. Law journals began publishing essays reflecting on the role of race, class, and unconscious bias in the interpretation of justice. One piece in particular, titled "The Gavel and the Glance, When Assumptions Precede the Law," quoted Alina's speech word for word in its introduction. It was shared in every top law school in the country. One professor said, "She didn't just speak, she exposed a fault line beneath the legal system, and now no one can pretend it's not there." Still, Alina remained grounded. She refused to let the attention change her, and she certainly didn't chase praise. Every day she walked into the courthouse with the same quiet strength. She listened, she read, she wrote. Her chambers remained simple, uncluttered. The only new item was the folded letter from the mother in St. Louis, now framed and hung quietly behind her desk. Not for visitors, but for her. A reminder of who she served. Then on a cold February morning, something unexpected arrived. Farah entered with a puzzled expression, carrying a heavy box marked with a government seal. She placed it on Alina's desk. "This came by special courier," she said. "No return name, just a note." Alina raised an eyebrow and opened the envelope taped to the top. The note was handwritten. "This is from the people who once looked away, who now choose to see." Inside the box were dozens of items, copies of letters, petitions, photographs, artwork, and small personal tokens. But they weren't random. Each one came with a name and a story. There was a drawing from a 10-year-old girl in Chicago who had watched the video and now wanted to become a civil rights lawyer. A folded American flag from a retired officer who wrote, "I was part of the problem once. I refuse to be anymore." A letter from a mother whose teenage son had been stopped and questioned for walking home from school, but who had come home safely and told her, "That lady from the video said I matter." A hand-carved wooden plaque from a formerly incarcerated man who had studied Alina's legal opinions while serving time and wrote, "Your words got me through prison. Your courage gave me purpose when I came out." Farah stood beside the desk in silence, watching as Alina gently lifted each item, read each note, absorbed each story. Her fingers paused on one letter written in shaky cursive from an elderly woman in Alabama who had lived through segregation. It read, "I never thought I'd live long enough to see a black woman sit on the nation's highest bench. But what you did that day, that was more than a seat. That was a stand." Alina felt the weight of the words settle into her chest. Not a burden, but a warmth, a quiet knowing that something irreversible had shifted in the collective consciousness. Not because she had shouted, not because she had fought with fire, but because she had stood still. She had let the world watch, and she had answered with dignity that echoed louder than any outburst ever could. Later that afternoon, she called Malik. "I got a package," she said softly. "Not the kind you expect." He laughed gently through the phone. "The world's thanking you, huh?" "No," she replied. "The world is telling me they saw it. That's more important." "Are you okay?" he asked. "I think I am," she said after a pause. "It still hurts in places I can't name. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm aware, and that's stronger than anger." There was a long silence between them. Then Malik said, "You changed something, you know." "I didn't change the world," she answered quietly. "I just reminded it of something it keeps trying to forget." And then she hung up, stood from her chair, and walked once more to the window. Outside, the clouds had parted. Sunlight spilled across the buildings, catching on the courthouse dome and the flags that rippled in the wind. Somewhere below, people walked the steps where it had all started. They would never know the full weight of that morning, but they would feel the difference in how the world treated them tomorrow, next week, or next year. Because the ground had shifted, and justice once again had taken a step forward, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. Spring arrived slowly that year. The bitter cold gave way to soft winds and light that lingered a little longer each day. Trees lining the courthouse square began to bloom, spreading soft pink petals that danced through the streets like confetti after a parade. The world kept moving as it always does. But something was different now. The space around Alina no longer felt invisible. It felt seen, not worshipped, not feared, just recognized. And in a world where silence often hides truth, recognition was a quiet kind of revolution. Inside the chambers, things remained steady. The staff worked with their usual rhythm. Papers moved, files stacked, cases argued. But underneath the routine was something new, a deeper stillness, like the calm that follows a storm, not because it's over, but because the ground has finally absorbed the rain. One afternoon, Farah entered with an odd look on her face. She held a crisp envelope sealed in wax, the kind reserved for rare occasions. "It's from the White House," she said. Alina raised an eyebrow, reaching for the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation, a special event honoring contributors to justice reform, civil rights, and public service. Her name was listed among a short list of recipients receiving the Presidential Medal of Honor for social impact. She stared at the words for a long time, not because she didn't feel worthy, but because she wasn't sure she wanted it. Not yet. Not while so many others still lived beneath the shadow she had walked through. Farah noticed her hesitation. "You don't have to go," she said gently. "You've already said enough." Alina looked up from the paper. "But maybe it's not about what I want to say. Maybe it's about the people who need to hear it." And so a week later, she stood beneath the golden lights of the East Room, surrounded by faces of all colors, titles, histories, senators, judges, community organizers, veterans, teachers, all gathered in recognition of lives that had shifted the country forward. When her name was called, she walked with calm steps to the stage. The president handed her the medal with both hands and said softly, "You didn't just carry justice into the courtroom. You carried it into the streets." She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. A reminder that a single moment of dignity can ripple through systems far bigger than any one person. After the ceremony, she walked alone through the gardens behind the building. The stars had begun to appear, and the air carried the soft hum of spring insects. She breathed in deeply, her heels clicking on the stone path, her eyes scanning the sky as if searching for something beyond applause, beyond recognition. That night, back in her hotel, she removed the medal and placed it carefully into her suitcase. Then she opened her laptop and read through a pile of appeal briefs waiting on her desk. Names of people who hadn't yet made headlines, who weren't trending, who hadn't been seen. A case from Texas caught her attention. A young man pulled over for a broken taillight, held without cause, arrested after asking too many questions. Nothing violent, nothing explosive, just another quiet injustice buried in paperwork. She read the file carefully, page by page. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting a response. Her words were sharp, clear, and anchored in law, but beneath every sentence was her heartbeat, the same one that had stood still on the courthouse steps months ago. At that moment, across the country, the young man sat in a jail cell, unaware that the most powerful black woman in the judicial system was reading his name, holding his story, and preparing to rewrite his fate. That was her real power, not the cameras, not the speeches, not the medal that now sat tucked in velvet and gold. Her power was in her pen, in her clarity, in the way she used her position not to stand above, but to reach down and pull others up. The next morning she returned to court. No photographers waited, no crowds gathered, but in her chambers a new opinion lay on her desk, one that would free a man, reshape a policy, and challenge a precedent. This was the work that mattered, not loud, not grand, just consistent, just. Months passed, and the world kept moving, but the echo of that morning outside the courthouse remained like a soft vibration beneath everything Alina touched. She didn't seek reminders of it. They came on their own, in handshakes that lingered a second too long, in the way young attorneys looked at her with wide, hopeful eyes, in the quiet nods from strangers who didn't need to say anything at all. But even as public attention shifted elsewhere, the system she had shaken continued to feel her weight. The Sightline Standard, a once controversial policy born from her experience, had now been adopted by more than 50 police departments nationwide. It wasn't perfect. No policy was, but it changed the lens. Officers were now required to undergo new training that focused not only on de-escalation, but on self-awareness. They were challenged to ask themselves questions before questioning others. What am I seeing? What assumptions am I making? Is my reaction based on behavior or bias? The results were already showing. Fewer use of force incidents, more community trust, a slow, stubborn shift in culture. Alina never took credit. She didn't need to. She saw the impact in ways that didn't need applause. One afternoon, she received a package from the Baltimore Police Training Academy. Inside was a simple black notebook, the kind cadets use during field exercises. On the front was a note: "We study your case every semester. You change how we train. Thank you for turning your silence into strength." Inside the notebook were handwritten reflections from new recruits. One wrote, "I used to think authority meant control. Now I understand it means responsibility." Another wrote, "I used to lead with suspicion. Now I start with listening." Alina sat with the notebook for hours, reading each page like a prayer. It wasn't a legal brief. It wasn't legislation, but it was proof. Change, even when slow, had taken root. Meanwhile, her courtroom remained the heart of her work. She handled everything from property disputes to constitutional challenges, but her rulings had begun to take on a distinct tone, still balanced, still grounded in law, but infused with a deeper demand for dignity. She wrote with clarity, but never coldness. Every word chosen, not just for legality, but for meaning. In one case involving a young black woman who had been wrongfully detained and then ignored by the court for nearly 2 years, Alina's opinion was devastating in its restraint. She wrote, "The law must never be silent where injustice is loud. To delay justice is to deny the humanity of the person waiting for it. This court does not excuse what was done. It only corrects it. Far too late, but not too little." Legal scholars called it one of the most human pieces of judicial writing in a generation. Law students printed it, highlighted it, memorized it, not because it was technical, but because it reminded them that justice could still breathe. But Alina kept herself distant from the celebration. She remained rooted in her daily work. Her staff knew not to bring up the headlines or the praise unless it directly related to a case. Not because she wasn't proud, but because she didn't want to become a statue. She wanted to stay in motion. She spent weekends mentoring girls from underserved schools, sometimes anonymously. She donated portions of her earnings to legal defense funds. She visited community centers in towns where she wasn't recognized and asked questions, not as a judge, but as a listener. And always she returned to the courthouse, not for power, but for purpose. Then came an invitation unlike any before. A national network of law schools asked her to author a new judicial ethics textbook, one that included not just law and precedent, but sections on humanity, unconscious bias, emotional intelligence, and ethical decision-making. She accepted, but insisted it not be published under her name alone. She invited contributions from public defenders, social workers, police officers, formerly incarcerated citizens, and even high school students. The final book was titled Justice is a Practice, Law, and the Human Thread. It wasn't just adopted in classrooms. It was adopted in departments, in courtrooms, in legal internships, and in programs designed to rebuild public trust in justice systems. When it was released, a young reporter asked her during a rare interview, "How do you define justice now?" She paused, thought, then answered, "Justice is not perfection. It's not punishment. It's not about winning. It's the decision to treat someone as if they matter, before you know if they do. Justice is the choice to see someone fully before you judge them partially." That quote went everywhere. But Alina returned to her office the next day and, without ceremony, went back to work. The world would remember the video. The country would remember the speech. But Alina had always believed the most powerful work isn't the part the world sees. It's the part that quietly reshapes everything after it. Years later, the courthouse steps looked the same. Polished stone warmed by the sun, the tall white columns casting long shadows across the wide plaza. Tourists still took photos there. Lawyers still rushed up the steps with open briefcases and tired eyes. Protesters still gathered on weekends, holding signs and chanting for one cause or another. The city, forever in motion, hadn't changed much on the surface. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Inside the courthouse, a group of high school students gathered in the gallery, whispering among themselves with a mix of nerves and excitement. It was their first visit to a federal courtroom. Their teacher, a woman named Layla with a warm voice and tired shoes, hushed them gently. "Eyes up, please. This isn't just any courtroom," she said. "This is where Justice Alina presides." The students quieted. Some looked toward the large double doors, waiting to see the figure they'd heard so much about. They had studied her opinions in class, watched the video of that long-ago morning on the courthouse steps, and read her essays in their civics books. To them, she wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of something bigger, proof that change could come quietly and still matter deeply. But Alina wasn't one for grand entrances. She stepped through the side door in her simple black robe. No announcements, no gavel slam. She moved like she always did, calm, focused, grounded. When she saw the students, her expression softened. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome." The teacher introduced the group and explained they had come to observe a live hearing as part of their civic education program. Alina nodded, then gestured for them to take their seats quietly. The hearing began. It wasn't a landmark case. It involved a tenant dispute, a missed court appearance, and a young man trying to keep his record clean after a string of bad luck. It wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't make headlines. But Alina treated it with the same care she would give a constitutional crisis. She listened. She asked clear, respectful questions. She made space for the man to explain. And when she ruled in his favor, granting him the chance to clear his record and enroll in a job program, she didn't do it with fanfare. She did it with grace. When the hearing ended, the courtroom emptied slowly, and the students were given permission to stay a moment longer. Alina stood before them, hands folded in front of her, the soft lines of age now resting at the edges of her eyes. One student, a girl named Marwa, raised her hand. "Justice Alina," she asked, "how did you keep going when people didn't believe you or see you clearly?" Alina looked at her for a long, thoughtful moment. "I reminded myself," she said slowly, "that being unseen by others doesn't make you invisible. It makes you a mirror. And sometimes when people are forced to see you, they end up seeing themselves too, and that scares them." She took a slow breath before continuing. "I kept going because I had to, because others couldn't, because every time someone in power looked past me, I imagined someone younger watching, and I wanted them to see what it looks like to stand anyway." The students listened, wide-eyed, silent. "Justice isn't a title," she said, voice quiet but firm. "It's a responsibility, and it's not given. It's practiced over and over when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, and especially when they doubt you most." There was a stillness in the room after she spoke, a silence that didn't need filling. Later, as the students left, Marwa turned back for one last look. Alina met her eyes and gave a small nod. Not grand, not heavy, just enough, and the girl smiled. That evening, Alina returned to her chambers, the quiet hum of the building surrounding her like an old friend. On the shelf above her desk sat the framed letter from Saint Louis, still protected behind glass. Next to it, a new item, an anonymous gift left outside her door, a single stone engraved with the words, "We saw you." She ran her fingers over it once, then placed it beside the letter. The courthouse lights dimmed. Outside, the trees rustled in the soft wind. And somewhere, beyond the tall glass windows, another young woman stood on a sidewalk, holding a folder, waiting to be seen. Alina had lit a path not with fire, but with patience. Not with noise, but with presence. And the light from that path continued forward, quietly, steadily, permanently, long after she had stepped into the shadows behind it. She had not just delivered justice, she had become it. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. Your support helps us keep telling the truth that needs to be heard.